So welcome everyone. Nice to see you all on this extremely sunny day. Congratulations for not being in the park. I'm sure that's slightly kept people away. It's so nice, isn't it, to have a summer, albeit extremely late. So my name is Maitreyabandhu, and I'm going to talk for a little bit about imagination and Buddhism. I think I've called it Imagination's Fire. I think that's right. And then there'll be time for hopefully some questions at the end, and we'll finish just before 2, about 10 to 2 if I can. I want to make a few announcements of other things that you might do here, and say a little bit about what you might do after coming here today. But yes, first of all I'll just talk for a bit, and then see where we get with what I'm saying. I'll sort of finish pretty much when I feel like it. No, I'll finish, actually usually when I feel like it. I'll finish in good time so that there's enough time for questions and so on. Somebody else? Come in. There's lots of places at the front, there's always lots of places at the front. Whenever I teach, there's always these, I don't know whether I'm to take it personally, but there is always those. Okay, so I want to talk today about imagination. It's something that I've personally thought about for many, many years, both in my 25 years, 26 years as a Buddhist particularly, but even before that, when I first came along to this Buddhist centre. In fact, when I first came to this room, I was at Goldsmiths Art College, along with Damien Hirst and the rest. He was just down the corridor. And I was very concerned with imagination and wanting to live an imaginative and creative life. It's only really, I think, through practicing Buddhism that I've understood what imagination is, or have deepened my understanding of what imagination is. So what I want to try and do in this little talk is, talk about imagination and talk about what you'd call a Buddhist vision of imagination, because I think that Buddhism is primarily concerned, you could say, at least one way of thinking about Buddhism, is primarily concerned with developing the imagination, discovering it, vivifying it, developing it, in all kinds of ways. And I won't be able to say as much as I'd like to say about it, because there's so much to say about it. But obviously I've been teaching now here in the centre for 22 years, something like that. And in the course of teaching, I'm often asked, what is Buddhism? Actually, increasingly people tell me what Buddhism is, which is slightly interesting, and I have to very politely correct them. But I'm often asked, what is Buddhism? And especially, I've been asked, is Buddhism a religion or a philosophy? People often seem to be concerned about that. Is it a religion or a philosophy? There seems to be in contemporary life a real concern about religion. And I think in many ways, very justifiably, religion can be a very dangerous thing, and increasingly looks like it might become a dangerous thing again. So often people want to know, what is Buddhism? Is it a religion, because I'm not very keen on this, or is it a philosophy? And I always find it very difficult to answer. I don't think there is a simple answer. The other thing, sometimes people actually say, oh, it's not a religion, is it? It's a way of life, which I always find unbearably bland. Presumably prostitution is a way of life, or being a gangster is a way of life. Sort of anything is a way of life. So saying it's a way of life doesn't get you out of the problem. It doesn't really say anything at all. So people want to know whether Buddhism is a religion or a philosophy. And it's very difficult because I sort of think, I don't know. No. I either want to say no to both of those things, or yes to both of those things, or ask me another question. Buddhism isn't like anything. It's a bit like going up to a person and saying, are you like my headmaster or like my mother? You sort of think, I don't feel like it. That's just me. It's a really odd question. Or are you like a guinea pig or a rabbit? I don't sort of feel like either. So Buddhism really isn't like anything. You can't, when you say what is Buddhism, you really can't say it's like this. Especially, I don't think you can say it's like religion or like philosophy. Buddhism doesn't fit any of the boxes that we in the West have created. And I think this is really interesting, that in the West what we've done is we've created more and more categories, haven't we? It's amazing what people can specialise in nowadays. I've got friends who are doing PhDs, and the arcane detail in which you can do a PhD is really quite remarkable, how much you can specialise. But of course all we've really got is this thing called life. Even that's a bit complex. All we've got really is this thing called experience, called our experience. We don't really have categories. They're something we've sort of made up to talk about things, but we don't live in those things really. So what the West has done over so many centuries is said, okay, there's a this and there's a that and there's the other. There's a religion, there's a philosophy, there's science, there's mathematics, there's psychology, there's cognitive behavioural therapy. Has created more and more things, categories, boxes. And Buddhism just doesn't fit into any of those. It doesn't fit into the religious box, doesn't fit into the philosophy box. Buddhism is just pointing at your life. It's concerned with your life. In other words, it's concerned with your experience right now. And it's concerned with how do you make the most of this life we have, this experience we have. I don't know whether that's a religion or a philosophy or a way of life or a science or whatever. So Buddhism is concerned with changing the whole of your life. It's not interested in just your intellectual life, or philosophy, or your religious life, whatever that would be. So it can't be likened to anything. You can't put it in a box. It doesn't fit in any boxes. You could say, of course, that Buddhism includes all of those things. There is an aspect of Buddhism that is religious, or seems a bit like religious. There's an aspect of Buddhism that's very philosophical. There's an aspect of Buddhism that's even scientific, certainly in the sense of psychology. Buddhism is in a way a psychology of the mind, an ethics of the mind, and so on. So you could say that Buddhism includes all of those things, or none of those things. But you see that the problem that we've got is a problem that we've created. Is it a this or a that? We created a this or a that. It's to mean all we've got is this life of ours. Here I am, I'm 51. What am I going to do with this life that I've got? And one of the things I know about life, probably the only thing I know about my life, is it's going to end. And of course the main thing I don't know about my life is when is it going to end. So Buddhism is concerned with that predicament that we are in. Anything serious, whether it's religious or philosophical or artistic or scientific, is concerned with that predicament we're in. That we have this thing called life, which we don't know when it's going to end, but we know it's going to end. All great art is concerned with that. So, when I'm asked, is it a religion or a philosophy, I can want to say it's kind of neither. It's not even Buddhism, by the way. Buddhism doesn't even fit into a box called Buddhism. I have friends who are very concerned about Buddhism, and I don't recognise Buddhism in it sometimes. It's like, unless it has the right hat, or the right title, or the right use of words, Buddhist-y words, technical Buddhist words, it doesn't count as Buddhism, if you see me. So Buddhism doesn't even fit in a box called Buddhism. If you look in the oldest texts of Buddhism, there's no word called Buddhism. Buddhism is a Western idea. It's an ism, like communism. There isn't any such thing in Buddhism that relates to Buddhism. It doesn't fit that box. It's not concerned with fitting any boxes. But if you were to say, okay, never mind all that all sounds very whatever, tell me what is it like in the West? Is it like a guinea pig or a rabbit? The first thing you'd want to say is that if you were to find a precedent for Buddhism in the West, you're very unlikely to find it in religious traditions in the West. So it's probably simplest and clearest to say the precedent for Buddhism in the West is not religious. So that this shrine room we've created here, even though it has certain sort of things that will remind you of Western religions, particularly theistic religions, it has a sort of sacred image, it has a sacred space. actually it has no relationship to Western religious tradition. Of course, the tradition I'm most used to is Christianity, but really there's nothing to do with each other. It's got as much relationship to snowboarding as it has to Christianity. Unfortunately, because Christianity is called a religion, and because people sometimes want to call Buddhism religion, you assume that there's some sort of relationship. But I'd rather snowboarding, frankly. So if you did want to say what is its precedent in the West, you wouldn't say it's a Western religious tradition, especially theistic traditions. I think that probably the best thing to say would be that the tradition in the West, which is most like Buddhism, is the tradition of the Western imagination. That would be most accurate, I think. That the concept of imagination in the West, with its great pedigree, is the most like what Buddhism is getting at. And that doesn't feel even like the Buddhism box that some people are very keen on, with the right outfits, the right words, the right beads, the right sandals, that all look Buddhist. Imagination, sort of, in a way, sort of wipes that all aside. Yeah? So I'd say that the place to look at in the West for something like Buddhism is the Western imagination. Now, imagination, the problem with that word is it tends to be discussed nearly always. In fact, I've hardly ever heard it discussed not in this way. It nearly always gets discussed in the context of the arts. And obviously the arts can be imaginative, although having been to art school myself and having written poetry for the last good few years, a lot of what goes by the name of art isn't art in any reasonable, in any way. But inevitably, when people talk about the imagination, the association with it is with the arts. And I'd obviously want to include at least some of that, the best in the arts. But really, imagination accounts for the best of human activity. It's really, imagination is pointing at the best in human activity, endeavour. So by imagination, I mean some of it includes the plays of Chekhov, the poems of Emily Dickinson, but I also want to include the science of Einstein and the mathematics of Newton, and much more. I even want to include the best in human communication, even I think the best in business, the most genuinely creative in business, the most genuinely creative in sciences, in sport. I've been struck by the Olympics, like many people have, and I was watching about high diving, synchronized high diving, how it's possible. I don't know, you have that view at the top of the diving board, and I just think, I wouldn't even want to go up there, never mind jump off it, never mind do a handstand and then jump off it on a handstand. And one of the things that was struck me is that you have to visualize the dive, and that visualization of the dive is very, very important. So it's an act of imagination. I think actually if you think about imagination deeply enough, actually what we are is an instant of imagination. And that our task is to uncover what we are, and that is imagination. That must be somebody calling us. So the trouble is, of course, is that the word isn't very. As soon as you move out of Buddhist language, you gain the benefit for not being technical and esoteric, but you create new problems, which is being misunderstood in new ways. So the problem with the word imagination is that it's become, in the West, terribly trivialized. People will actually say that's just your imagination. In other words, that isn't anything. People will be even criticised at times. I remember being criticised for being too imaginative as a child. So we need to be sort of much clearer, I think, about what I mean, what Buddhism might mean, what a contemporary Buddhist would mean when they're trying to talk about imagination. And the clearest person in the West to talk about it probably is the English Romantic poet Coleridge. He was very concerned with imagination, as the Romantics were generally, Coleridge, Wordsworth and so on, Southey and so on, Keats later on. Interestingly, the Romantic imagination came about partly as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. One of the touching things about. I was really enjoyed the opening ceremony of the Olympics, which was a ritual, wasn't it? Interestingly, quite obviously a ritual, and they enacted the trauma of the Industrial Revolution. Actually, it was a trauma in one hand, but incredibly beneficial. We're still living off the benefits of that in so many ways. Many of us would be grindingly poor without it. Most of us would be, actually. In fact, that would mean that most of us wouldn't be here. We'd be dead. So one has to be careful with even criticising that. But Coleridge, Wordsworth and so on really understood immediately what this would do. They'd say it would destroy value. Everything would become part of the marketplace. Actually, interesting, later on you get Marx and Engels saying just that once you allowed for the market, everything would become market-driven. They were saying even things like education would become a market, and there we go. That's exactly what we're doing now. We're creating schools have to be businesses, and so on. And it's increasingly a disaster, isn't it, what we're doing? It's also got many good things, of course. So what Coleridge does, and Coleridge is a very great, some people think of him as one of the greatest Western thinkers, although terribly hamstrung by his Christian upbringing and very hamstrung by his own sort of personal faults. He was addicted. He was one of the first great addicts. He was addicted to morphine. What was it before morphine? And opium, that's right, and struggled the greater part of his life with opium addiction before any real understanding of addiction. Actually quite brilliant about it. Anyway, I won't go into too much. But he distinguishes between imagination and fantasy, or fancy. And this point that he tries to make, I think, is brilliant. So he's trying to say that, okay, we do have this faculty called imagination. And the important thing about imagination is it's a faculty. It's something you already have, like eyesight, like reason. But like reason, for instance, you can use it more or less. You can be reasonable more or less. And he says that we've got this faculty of imagination which we can use more or less. The important thing about imagination for Coleridge is that it unifies reason and emotion, firstly. So it's like a whole activity. It's not just you thinking or you feeling, it's the unification of feeling and emotion. And by unifying feeling and emotion, something new comes into being. Instead of acting with part of ourselves, so often we do what we think is best, but we don't want to do it, or we do what we want to do, but we know it's not best. We're acting partially much of the time. But imagination means that we can act wholly. We can act with our thought and with our feeling in the same moment. And of course he's very concerned about that because he knows that the best poetry, what is really poetry, arises out of this unified faculty of imagination where thinking is feeling and feeling is thinking. When you're in that touch with that, something new arises. It always takes you a little bit beyond yourself. I mean, as I say, I've been writing poetry quite a lot recently. That's something I always feel I need to confess. Anyway, it's something to confess. Anyway, there you go. But one of the striking things about it is what one means by writing it is not just writing things that sound vaguely like poetry. What one means by it is that at the very best, something new is discovered. And it's one of the great joys of life. You're just writing about something, and suddenly a whole world of imaginative experience is discovered. And it's incredible when that happens. It's just wonderful. Just as Einstein thinks and thinks and thinks and suddenly has this imaginative new reach into a new depth, just as Newton presumably did the same. Suddenly imagination takes you beyond the scope of reason, beyond yourself, beyond who you think you are, and beyond what you think you can do. My first real experience of this was at art school. There I was, painting in my little studio, Damien House down the road down there, Sarah Lucas up downstairs, doing something. She wasn't doing something with fried eggs at the time, I can't remember what she was doing there. Very nice woman. there I was, and I was painting these small little abstract paintings. And I was doing these pictures of these bushes, still got the painting upstairs, and I got into a problem with the bottom right-hand corner of the painting. I couldn't work it out. If anyone's ever painted, the bottom right-hand corner is particularly problematic. I often ended up trying to sort out the bottom right-hand corner. And I had this little tiny bush in the bottom right-hand corner, and I thought, I think it's too bright a colour, so you darken it. No, that's not that. And you think, it's too big, so you make it smaller. No, it's not that. And I thought, I think it just needs to move slightly, so I moved it slightly like that. It was like that. It's just like, actually, when I say bush, it was just a blob of paint. And I moved the blob of paint like that. And as soon as I did that, the painting, it became a painting. Never, it's one of my most dramatic experiences of that. Before that, it was just a chaos, and then suddenly, I had in front of me this painting, and I just knew it, and I thought, that's it. I'm like, it's the goal. I wanted to run around the art school. It was a fantastic experience. What was incredible about it is that every mark on that painting I'd made, every single mark, I'd put the ground, it was just on a little board about that big, and I'd work, I'd scrape stuff off and put more stuff on. Every single mark I made on that painting, I had done it, and yet by moving it slightly more diagonally, something completely new was in the painting that I hadn't done. It was really weird, and I remember sitting looking at it, thinking, what's happened here? Something new has come into being, but where from? Because I've done everything on this painting, and yet something now has appeared which I didn't do. I don't know what that is, but it's fantastic. It's not just that you think it's fantastic, you think this is what life is. This is what I want my whole life to be, that I've done all this, and yet some animating presence somehow has stepped into it. So it went beyond me, do you see what I mean? Not beyond me in a literal sense. There wasn't, no God came down and painted the last bit. But that change, I didn't do. I didn't. The depth of reason of interaction between the painting, I couldn't have done. Cézanne, somebody once said, looking at Cézanne, that it was like every part of the painting knew about every other part of the painting. Every colour was responding to another colour. And you can't do that with your mind. You're just not, frankly, up to it. You can never write a poem. You can never write it. You can never come up with a new proof, mathematical proof. You can never, anything that's valuable, you can't do. You can do the work, and something else can step into it. Even real communication. I spend a lot of my time now trying to talk to people, and I say nice things. I'm a nice enough person. So I thought, how are you doing? Sometimes, frankly, I'm bored by my own questions. Sometimes I'm bored by the replies. But sometimes communication happens, and you couldn't do it, but you're experiencing it. Just yesterday, I went out for a walk with somebody and talked about this. By the end, I was in a kind of ecstasy. I hadn't snorted anything. I was in a kind of ecstasy, and it was to do with, I was in communication, this mysterious thing called communication, which was, it's something to do with me imagining, I haven't meant to say all this, but something to do with me imagining. Communication, really, when you really communicate, it's this mutual experience of imagining. I'm imagining you, and you're imagining me, and that imagination is becoming more and more accurate, and something else steps into it. There's something that happens in communication that I can't say it was me, and I can't say it was you. Just as in that painting, there was something that happened that I didn't do, and yet completed me. The lovely line in the American poet Wallace Stevens, he says, "The tune beyond us, yet ourselves," which is a wonderful way of saying it, that what you're ending up with is a tune beyond us. But just to correct that metaphor, it's not literally beyond us, it's yet ourselves, and yet completes us. So when I finished that painting, it felt it completed me. It wasn't just my best painting. It set a new benchmark for what I could do. And then of course you try and do another one, you can't do that again. So you just think, that's really weird when you paint. I don't know whether you then try and do another one. You think, what's wrong with these brushes? It worked yesterday. You just go, well, that looks ridiculous. That looks even worse. You know what I mean? And it's like weird. You think, well, they don't work today. You know what I mean? And you try your best, and and then suddenly, sometimes you discover it again. So that's what courage is getting at. This new faculty that unifies, discovers something new, something that goes beyond you, something that always goes a bit beyond you. Do you see how that's what Buddhism's talking about? Something that unifies you, something that goes beyond, and then in the basis of that unification, goes beyond you, transcends you, but not literally transcends you, but not merely metaphorically transcends you. Something steps in to your experience. Yeah? So, in very, very different languages, the language of imagination and the language of Buddhism are pointing at the same experience. I think Buddhism imagines more deeply than imagination, and it actually tells you, shows you a path to unfold your imagination to beyond your imagination. The Buddha represents everything you can't imagine. Because the problem with our usual sense of, like goal setting for instance, is that you can only create the goals that you can think of. But Buddhism is trying to say, actually, you've got much more to you than you think, that you can even imagine. But just going back to courage then distinguishes imagination from fantasy or fancy. And fancy is just the same old things in a new combination. So there's nothing new comes into it. So a lot of art, a lot of science, a lot of writing, a lot of philosophy, a lot of religion, it's just the same old thing in brand new drag, as Iggy Pop I think said. It's just the same old. So as I say, I've been involved in contemporary poetry, and frankly, much of it I can't get on with at all. It's just sophisticated chatter at work. It's just clever things. So if you work it for a while, you can write a poem that involves a zebra, a stick of underarm deodorant, a hypodermic syringe, an orange, and your mother. You can write a poem that has all of those things, and at first glance it'll look imaginative, but it's not. It's just that you've jumbled the usual things of experience and put them in a funny way. Nothing new is discovered. No deeper unity is found. It's really just a poet in a funny hat and a big, and a red nose and big banana shoes. And at first it's a bit entertaining, but it quite quickly is actually frankly boring and eventually even irritating. And this is true of us, isn't it? We sometimes do that in our own conversations, in our own talks even, and so on. So fancy is just the same old things put in a new way. Fantasy is really Freud said that fantasy is really wish fulfillment, isn't it? That's why the archetype of fantasy is pornography, because it's merely what you wish would happen. So imagination is nothing to do with wish fulfillment. It's not because pornography does is imagining a much better looking you sleeping with a much better looking him or her. If you see what I mean. It's nothing new comes into being, actually. Something less comes into being. So the main thing about imagination is that something more comes into being. You discover something. So I've said, and I'll finish here because I was going to say much more than I'll do for now, and you can ask some questions. I think it has 5 primary aspects of imagination. So you experience yourself as having discovered something. And this is true of communication, genuine communication. It's true of genuine meditation. It's true of genuine art practice. It's true of philosophy. You experience something that you didn't know before. Any poet who's trying to write poetry, they know that until you've discovered something in a poem, you haven't written a poem, however laudable the sentiments. It's characterised, secondly, by unity. So you feel, in the genuine imaginative act, you feel more unified. You feel more complete. And you feel unified in a way that you couldn't have done yourself. Especially, you feel unified in terms of reason and emotion. You're no longer a thinking person who wants to do the good thing and an emotional person who just wants to have fun. You feel a new sort of unity. Interestingly, one of the hallmarks of valuable art is that they are more unified. The reason why Elizabeth Bishop is one of the best poets of the century is because her poems are more unified. I recently went to see Hamlet, and one of the things that struck me again is just how unified all the metaphors are. All the themes echo and mirror each other in a way that Shakespeare could never have written. That's why you have to doubt whether he wrote them, because they're so incredibly unified that you just can't do it with your conscious mind. But we've all had experiences of that to some degree. If you don't believe me, read Elizabeth Bishop. The third faculty, the third characteristic of imagination is aliveness. So when you're genuinely in touch with imagination, you feel genuinely more alive, by which I don't mean more ebullient. I don't even mean necessarily more up. You just feel more alive, and what's even spookier, the object of your imagination seems alive as well. So that painting that I'd finished suddenly seemed to be alive in some way. When you, presumably in science, you discover something and it feels that the idea itself is somehow alive from its own side, and is, as it were, looking at you. The usual dichotomy of self and object is transcended a bit. So you feel more alive, and strangely the object seems more alive. The fourth element I wanted to bring in is playfulness. That imagination often has an aspect of play, because you can't do it. You can't do it seriously, you have to discover it. You sort of discover it at the corner of your eye. You have to try, but you can't try too hard. That's why so often you have your best ideas when you get into the bath. When I'm writing, I often have my best ideas when I'm walking to the loo. I'm writing away trying to think. And I think, look, you really must go to the loo. So I go to the loo, and because I'm not thinking anymore, I suddenly think, oh yes, I know what I'm trying to say. Does anyone have that? You didn't need to know that, but anyway, there you go. And then the fifth aspect I want to bring out of imagination is that you ascend in some way. You discover more. That when you feel genuinely imaginative, you feel that life has got a much greater meaning and purchase than you thought. That there is more to life. There is a larger life that you've touched the hem of, and that you feel that you must live out. This is what powers artists, really, is that they touch the hem of a larger life, and their way to it has been through the arts. There's real dangers in that way, actually, but Buddhism is saying, yes, there is more to life, there is a larger life, and actually there are lots of ways to it. Meditation, ethical life, communication, friendship, community. There are all these ways to this larger life, and then, yes, that is the purpose of life. And when you had that imaginative experience and felt that this is the very meaning of life, Buddhism is saying, yes, it is. It is the meaning of life, yeah. And your life needs to be a life dedicated to that, to living that out, not as an idea. Meaning isn't an idea, like, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, which was, 45 or 47, I can't remember. It's not an idea, it's a particular quality of experience, which you know it when you have it, don't you? Interestingly, you often experience it around death. I remember when my father died, I felt myself to be in touch with some larger life. I couldn't quite understand it because I thought perhaps I am a monster. I don't seem to feel the right emotions. What I felt was a certain sort of grace, a certain sort of plenitude, a certain sort of aliveness and peace. It didn't last, but I felt myself to be on the edge of some larger life. And that when you're on the edge of that larger life, everything kind of makes sense. Everything kind of shines with that larger life. And it's not God, but it's not just matter either. It's not just this stuff that people keep insisting is the nature of reality. That is an ugly idea, and not a scientific one. Anyone who's even put their toe into quantum physics and so on, matter isn't what we think it is. It's simply not. So ideas that there is just stuff called matter that you bump into and will eventually knock you over is just not even a scientific idea. It's just not an imaginative one. Okay, so that's all I think I've got to say. That's my talk. Actually, I was going to say a bit more, but as usual, I always say things I didn't mean to say and then don't end up saying things I did. So we've got a bit of time.